Well, I'll try to keep in the time limit, but let me just say some words concerning Magda's presentation. I was very happy to hear this very concise information on the status of the European Union. And I must say that we have had many conferences in the past, or a series of conferences, not only with Polish and German constitutional lawyers, but also with lawyers from other European countries. And these conferences showed two things. First, when lawyers talk to each other, the atmosphere is much more sober and rational than the political atmosphere that surrounded us, the emotional and often propaganda-laden atmosphere. And I would really encourage all of us to continue these kinds of talks. The second thing we saw is that the breaches, David already mentioned this yesterday, don't go between the nations. This only seems like that because official propaganda comes from the governments and the media around them, but it goes through the nations, through the nation states. In all states, there are both sides, the one which I would call the postmodern or woke side and ideology, and on the other side, the more traditional. I would not say conservative because this is a negative expression, but let us say modern understanding of law, modern times and postmodern times. And the modernity is a fruit, an outcome of enlightenment. And we should really keep to that and also keep back or go backwards to the roots in Christianity and antiquity and cherish all this. On the other side, of course, we should not fight the fights of former times, but look into the future. But now let me try to explain what I have to say on this context and start with my presentation. And the topic is the European Union, yet another European empire or an institution sui generis. And I will start with this. At this conference, we have heard impressive presentations on empires that have defined history over the last 4 millennia. In doing so, we have considered how these empires legitimized their rule and in particular how they presented themselves as successors or renewers of brilliant empires. If we have meanwhile moved our focus to the present, and it is only natural that we turn our attention to the European Union and ask ourselves the questions of whether it is an empire and how it places itself in historical continuity by linking up with an idealized past. As a legal scholar, and Magda also had the same approach, I will approach the question primarily from a legal perspective by analyzing the European treaties with regard to these questions. In doing so, however, the problem arises that the term empire is not a legal concept, as also indicated by Magda. And not only that, even among historians and political scientists, there seems to be no full consensus on how to define it. I will therefore begin my lecture with a brief conceptual clarification with regard to our research interest, and then evaluate the existing European treaties accordingly. To say it right from the start, of course, the European Union itself is not an empire, but part of a global empire led by the United States. Nor does it have a strategy for its own legitimization in the sense of translatio or renovatio imperii. Instead, it is in this respect completely disoriented and downright oblivious of history. This could be the end of the lecture. In fact, however, the real investigation only begins at this point. For the statement that the European Union is not an empire raises the delicate but ultimately decisive question of what it is then and what it should be. This problem, discussed under the heading legal nature of the European Union, has occupied legal scholars and legal practice for a long time, actually since the beginning of European integration. The term legal nature sounds very formalistic, and generally the legal debates on the subject remain very abstract. As a result, it has been agreed that the EU is neither a conventional league of states, in German Staatenbund, nor a federal state, Bundesstaat. It is something completely new an institution sui generis. This is my hypothesis. However, this merely evades the problem in a formula compromise, or it's not only my hypothesis, but the official legal hypothesis. The underlying questions of sovereignty cannot be solved on the basis of the conventional dualism between national law and international law. But if we evade the problem, we run a considerable legal and political risk, which could ultimately lead to the failure of the entire European project if tensions escalate. However, the question raised at this conference concerning the EU's possible claim to get power and the Union's historical self-image, the empire question, which comes from outside the law, is capable of taking us a great deal further in this respect. So we get an impulse as the lawyers from the historians, for example. For these questions open our eyes to a third model, which has certainly existed historically in modern Europe, but which has mentally been suppressed by the strictly dualistic legal thinking of the 20th century. Let us call it a confederation. I know that all these terms are heterogeneous and prone of misunderstandings, but let me later define what I understand under a confederation. We will here have to characterize the model and to explain under which conditions such an entity can be stable and to what extent the European Union already exhibits its characteristics. This must be followed by a debate on how the European treaties might be amended in order to establish a confederation that internally preserves the freedom and self-determination of the European peoples and externally guarantees their security. Furthermore, we will have to discuss the role of history in the construction of the Confederation's legitimacy. So let us start with the question, what is an empire? The number of proposed definitions in literature is, as I said, very large and heterogeneous. If we assumed in the announcement of our conference that, roughly defined, we are dealing with major political powers with universal pretensions, then we can now specify this definition as follows. We should speak of an empire when there is a large-scale political ruling structure that comprises a multitude of states or other original ruling units, kingdoms or whatever in the past, and has a central power that can, if necessary, bring the subunits into line with a threat or exercise of coercion, even if they are formally sovereign. It is in line with this definition that some voices in literature demand that the imperial center has more than hegemonic influence and that the included units only have a more or less limited autonomy. So far, the characteristics that must be given to be able to speak of an empire. In addition, there are other features that are usually also given and then characterize the ideal typical empire. For example, the regularly very large territorial extent of an empire and the considerable number of units included mean that empires are almost always multi-ethnic or even multi-religious in nature. This in turn pushes for the formation of a universalistic imperial ideology and symbolism that promises to hold the heterogeneous elements together and unfolds a civilizing dynamic both internally and externally, which in turn sparks a tendency towards permanent territorial expansion, often including conquest. Now, is the European Union an empire? I think we can keep this discussion short. Of course, according to its treaties and according to its political practice, the European Union is not and should not be an empire in this sense. Some essential conceptual features are not given from the outset. In particular, the headquarters in Brussels lacks the ability to force seriously recalcitrant member states to obey its orders or to prevent them from leaving the Union. And instead of an inspiring idea that could serve as a bond and incentive, one technocratic project after the other is laid out, the failure of which is then inadequately covered by desperate appeals to the people's enthusiasm for Europe. What is decisive, however, is the fact that the European Union itself can only be regarded as one of several provinces in the US global empire. The three European communities were founded with strong support by the USA as another essential instrument for geopolitical control and protection of the western part of Europe. Evidently, the EU has been tightly woven into the texture of the Pax Americana up to the present day. But if the European Union, but if the European Union is not an empire, what kind of institution is it? And what is its potential for the future? If one looks at the treaties, it becomes clear. Neither is the European Union a federal state, nor a mere league of states, Bundesstaat or Staatenbund in the conventional German terminology. According to Article 1 of the Treaty on European Union, as quoted by Magda earlier, its purpose is to create an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe. Throughout the treaties, the term peoples is used in the plural, from which it can be concluded that the treaties themselves do not assume a single European nation. This is confirmed by the fact that citizenship in the Union is merely a consequence of citizenship in a member state. Likewise, the territory of the EU is composed of the territories of the member states. And it is the principle of conferral that applies to sovereign powers of the European institutions. Thus, they can only exercise those competencies that have been expressly transferred to them by the member states by way of the treaties. Consequently, all three elements of the concept of the state, people, territory, and sovereign power, are not originally given in the case of the European Union, but are derived from the member states. The latter ones are sovereign. They are and remain the masters of the treaties. However, the treaties clearly point beyond a classical league of states and towards a possible future change into a federal state. And the treaties leave it open. This should perhaps be emphasized. They do not speak about the so-called finalité of the whole integrational project. Union citizenship may be derivative, but it entitles EU citizens to vote in all other member states on local and European levels and to enjoy the protection of diplomatic and consular authorities of other member states in third countries. The territory may be composite, but it has now been developed into an area of freedom, security, and justice without internal borders and into a single market with extensive economic freedoms. The sovereignty of the European bodies may be subject, the sovereignty of the European bodies may be subject to the principle of conferral, but in fact, the competencies already conferred also include tasks and powers that have traditionally been considered part of the core of statehood. Moreover, over the decades, the EU institutions have repeatedly usurped competencies illegally for themselves when it seemed opportune to do so. There has rarely been effective resistance to that. This can be proven. I don't have the time here for proving this. On the contrary, in the conclusion of the European treaties in the past, pro-integration forces have repeatedly succeeded in pushing through a special kind of legal arrangements that is commonly referred to as applying the method Monet, also mentioned earlier. In these cases, the transfer of competencies from the member states to the European Union was designed in such a way that it did not lead to a stable situation. I will bring examples in a minute. But on the contrary, was intended from the outset to unleash an additional dynamic of integration. This was the approach taken right from the beginning when the European Economic Community was founded. The establishment of a common market triggered a lowering of national standards of social, environmental, or consumer protection due to competition, so-called race to the bottom, and thus built up political pressure, which led to the community being granted further powers to harmonize laws and shape legislation. The same approach was taken with the introduction of the euro. Here too is a supposedly carefully balanced stability architecture was agreed upon, but not enough provisions were made for the occurrence of economic shocks, So that in the Euro crisis, which came after the financial crisis in the United States, adjustments to the legal framework were implemented in a surprise move. In addition, open violations of the law took place against which, in view of the emergency of the situation, an effective opposition was hardly possible. The result was, again, a strong push towards a federal state without broad political discussion and democratic legitimization of this transferal of competences. With all this, the European Union goes far beyond the conventional League of States. As a result, legal scholars agree that it is neither a federal state nor a league of states, but an institution sui generis. The Court of Justice of the European Union speaks of a new legal order in international law and of an independent source of law. The German federal, I should skip, sorry, to the next one, yeah. The German Federal Constitutional Court speaks of a community of its own kind and in a linguistic neologism of a Staatenverbund. You see, this is neither Staatenbund nor Bundesstaat, it is Staatenverbund, a technical term which we did not know before that. These are all formulas intended to cover up the fact that the European Union does not fit into any of the existing categories. The result is that the different basic understandings of the legal nature of the European Union collide abruptly if dispute arises. The outcome of judicial decisions in such cases is not legally predictable because we don't have the categories. Rather, they are in fact purely political decisions. In the case of the Court of Justice of the European Union, which sees itself as a motor of integration, they will reliably be in favor of the European Union. While national constitutional courts, not only the German one, not only the Polish one, but all others too, increasingly dare to openly oppose this in the interest of member states' sovereignty. In doing so, they invoke a supposedly obvious overstepping of competences on the part of the European institutions, so-called ultra vires acts, or a violation of national constitutional identity. However, there is a possibility to interpret the European Union in another way. This interpretation may not fully eliminate the legal and power political conflicts that can arise, but it can help to facilitate their moderation. In older constitutional literature, a model of a confederation is described alongside the League of States and the federal state as a third independent intermediate stage. This is an association of states on a treaty basis. Its members join voluntarily, but they cannot terminate their membership at will because it places the member states in a comprehensive political system and thus permanently changes their constitutional status. All our national constitutions have been changed by the European treaties if we don't define constitution formally as the written text of a national constitution, but as the basic order, the basic political order in a state. The EU treaties have changed our constitutions. Such a confederation is intended to preserve the self-determined political existence of its member states, but in order to permanently promote the common purpose, it must subject them to certain rules, compliance with which is enforced by coercive means if necessary. This results in an antinomy. Yeah? There is a paradox. Self-determination shall be protected. The states join this association in order to protect their self-determination, but they must subject themselves to this new association. This results in an antinomy that neither the member states are simply subordinate to the confederation, nor is the confederation subordinate to the member states. The question of sovereignty remains permanently in the balance here. And the essence of the confederation consists precisely in this existential connection on the one side, and in this fragile balance on the other side. And there are historical examples for that and even for the fact that they can last for a long time. Such an association of states can only be stable if they exhibit a minimum homogeneity between the member states. According to the older literature cited or quoted here, this can consist in an ethnic or religious similarity, but also in common civilizational foundations, including the accordance of fundamental political principles like, for example, democracy and the rule of law. Only such homogeneity, the preservation of which must be institutionalized, has the effect that the extreme cases of conflict within the confederation will not occur or will not end the confederation at least. As is well known, the European Union in its current treaty configuration already largely exhibits the characteristics of such a confederation. The treaty describes this model very clearly. According to Article 1, the European Union is an ever closer union among the peoples of Europe, where I understand ever closer not as integrating legally more and more, transferring more competencies to the center, but to bringing the nations closer to each other. The overall aim is to promote peace, common values, and the well-being of the peoples thus united. This is what Article 3 says. In this context, particular emphasis is placed on the fact that the European Union, in establishing an area without internal frontiers and a single market, should always bear in mind what historically constitutes Europe. Our old Western European or Abendland tradition. It should respect Europe's rich cultural and linguistic diversity. This is what Article 3 of the Treaty on European Union says. The European Union should respect Europe's rich cultural and linguistic diversity and ensure that Europe's cultural heritage is safeguarded and enhanced. It should also respect the essential state functions of the members and their respective national identities inherent in their fundamental structures, political and constitutional. This is what the treaties say in Article 4. However, these treaty provisions have taken a backseat in the political practice of the European Union. It is therefore advisable to start a discussion on this end and also to push for a number of treaty clarifications and amendments. And the conferences with Magda and with Professor Krasnodębski, which I mentioned earlier, had the aim of thinking about these clarifications and amendments. And I cannot repeat what we discussed there, but I would like to shorten it. Firstly, the scope of tasks and powers of the European Union must be adapted to the ideal. This means that some powers must be taken back to the national states, whereas on the other side, we might discuss to transfer more power to the European Center in questions of foreign policy and defense. This is my personal opinion, of course. Secondly, we will have to talk about organizational innovations in order to restore the balance between the EU institutions on one side and the member states on the other side. And thirdly, and closely related to this, the application of the méthode Monnet must be abandoned, and the postmodern reinterpretation of the law, for example, by using the so-called values or the fundamental rights as competence titles, must be stopped, because this is clearly illegal and against the methods of the law. This last point is the most important. The cultural flowering of the European civilization in the past centuries was based on its specific concept of freedom, the rule of law, and democracy. Keeping the knowledge of the meaning of these concepts alive in the future generations against propaganda and against postmodern misinterpretation is one of the most important tasks of all Europeans. And it unites us. I know it from our discussions, not only the Poles and the Germans, but also the French and the Dutch, etc., participants of our conferences. And this brings us to the fourth and final demand. What is needed in a pan-European network of educational institutions consciously dedicated to the cultivation of the European, the Occidental heritage and its roots in antiquity and Christianity. Let me sum up what I said. The European Union is not an empire, not in the strict sense, at least. There may be some attempts from certain interest groups to turn it into an empire, but it is not, according to the treaties, and I think it should not be. It is a confederation. This means a self-organization of sovereign member states conceived to guarantee their security externally and to preserve the self-determination of the European nations on the basis of their common civilizational ground, a civilization that is rooted in the ancient world and in Christianity and was formed in a common all-European history since the Middle Ages through Renaissance and Enlightenment up to the present day. And we must try to find out, when looking back into the history, not only about the conflicts, we should not cherish these conflicts, but to try to find out this common heritage that has made Europe great in the past. And that is really a wisdom and a treasure for the future if we discuss it soberly and rationally and with a view to the future. As the EU is not an empire and should not be an empire, a legitimation by translatio or renovatio imperii is impossible. But this does not mean that history and historical legitimation don't count. A modern European confederation determined to master the future will have to safeguard and enhance its cultural diversity, as the EU treaty already expresses it, and its rich cultural heritage. There should not be a renovatio imperii, but a renovatio culturae et civilisationis, a renovatio europaeae. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear Gert, for that very thoughtful, nuanced, objective presentation of this question. Is the European Union an empire? Should it be an empire? What is it? If it is a confederation, how should it be organized in order to make it clearer? And your really heartwarming appeal to, again, developing some form of emotional solidarity to our own past, to our tradition, to our culture, and the need for a renovatio Europae. And of course, this leads over, obviously, also to our ideal of hesperialism, as we have expressed it in our books, Renovatio Europae, Europa Aeterna, to which you have also contributed. So I think you made all that, I think, extremely clear. This is, I think, also a very nice closing talk also for our conference that ties it back to all these questions we have tried to deal with during these last days. There was a question already by Professor Krasnodębski from last paper, so I guess it is still certainly valid in this context, and there will be, of course, also, I'm quite sure, further questions, remarks. So I just give over the mic to Professor Krasnodębski.
Yes, the fundamental question is, of course, what European Union is, and but also the questions where we have to look to find the answer on this question. Should we look at the treaties and legal framework? Should we interpret this? What is it? Or should we look at the political reality? Should we use a method of legal scholar, or should we be more empirically, like political scientists, sociologists, or MEP who looks at the, at the functioning of the union from a very close distance? And I think the problem is that you mentioned that there is, of course, and we in the treaty, it is ever close in union. There was an intention to be more integrated. Yeah, it is written down. But there was what is now criticized. One of the main postulates from critics of the current state of the Union is to delete this theological process, because it's a. But at least it was always said that how. Because in the sentences you quoted is also that this treaty is a step in this process. That this process, because what is the nature of this? This process should be also legally regulated. And now the treaty we have, we all know this is the failed constitution. This is also in a way also legitimacy of this treaty is the question, because after the constitution was abolished by voters in France and the Netherlands, through the back door, through as a typical Merkel method, it returned. For instance, there is no French and I think the majority of Europe didn't want super state and a flag and the national hymn as a nationality. But it's there as a flag is not symbols, and so probably it's a original sin of the current state of the Union. That it is backdoors, and now we have the situation. I don't know if you agree as a boss, and that we have growing discrepancy between political praxis as what is really, for instance, in the climate policy and so. And these treaties. So there's a legal and political reality more and more. What is really funny, because the Commission said rule of law. Rule of law is so important, let's say in Poland, but it is not so important in Brussels. Because it is evidently that there are some competences. There are. And this stage of the European integration, there are these competences of the Union. This is they are not well defined, and so both sides of the dispute today argue that maybe there is a necessary to change the treaty. So let's say Guy Verhofstadt, Manfred Weber, and so they say once Verhofstadt said in one of our meetings. This is dysfunctional, these treaties, because we are much more further in in this not legally actually legitimized integration. So we have to adopt our legal framework to the current situation. This is the others say, okay, now we have to stop this process and then look at the treaties. We have then to precise, as Professor Morgenthau said, and Professor Baimczek also, we have to make a precision what are really then in this treaty. So the problem is, of course, and we are now talking that I understand, I agree that maybe Europe is not empire, but this is the questions if Europe is confederation of states, because to go further, there is a Verhofstadt dilemma that to go further on the legal way, to change the treaty, you have to have agreement of the member states. So how to say we can change the treaty without, all this process. And this is why the idea of the Conference of Future of Europe actually emerged as a kind of legitimacy of this process without actually have to really engage with the citizens and with the member states. Now, but now back to is it confederation? Not, maybe it's an emerging confederation, because it can be after this treaty change, but maybe everybody knows that now it would be very difficult to find an agreement. Even Annalena Baerbock said once, I think a month ago, 2 months ago, no, this idea to organize the convention and started the process of the treaty change, this is not the proper method to achieve this goal. the question is, what is the proper method to achieve the goal? But my question is also to Professor Morgenthau, also to Professor Baimczyk. Yeah, because you use also the question power center. Yeah, it's evidently it is power structure. Yeah, power structure. Yeah, but for my question is, yeah, but where is this power? Is it where's the center? Is this maybe it's an eccentric empire? You know, there are some centers in a place. It's really power structure. It is not like, you know, I say 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, let's say, association of the equal states. Evidently not. Yeah, there is really asymmetry of the, and power is always about asymmetry of the. So this is the questions. Where is it really? Is it really Ursula von der Leyen who has? Where's the? Yeah, in the former structure, we could actually show what is the center. Yeah. And the second, also my skeptical also about this, because you said this postmodern addresses to values, but then on the other hand, you pointed out to the questions of the common culture, civilization, and history. And once again, this is object of the. This is also. Yeah, it depends on the hermeneutic of interpretation. What does it mean? What does it? Is it not actually the same, but expressed in a different language? So there are two questions also, which I put also about this power structure, about this common culture, and at least as a source of the, you said, as outmost or the last legitimation of this, let's say, of this political structure. Maybe it is confederation, I would say it's probably could be a confederation in making.
Thank you very much, Professor Krasnodębski, for these questions. And I would try to explain my approach again first. As a lawyer, I don't want to paint a picture like an architect, more geometrical, how I loved Europe to be, but I have to take the given situation. This is why I took the European treaties as a basis and tried to find out what is the guiding idea. And the problem there is that the treaties, in fact, don't say it. And there is hardly any discussion about that in legal doctrine, but also as far as I see beyond that. And therefore, we have this unsolved problem, and we have this old dualistic approach. Either the states are sovereign, Staaten, Bund. Then this also refers to your first question, the power structure. Then the power is totally with the member states, and the central an international organization or so is just an administration on behalf of the states who are fully in power. And the other extreme, and there are only these two alternatives traditionally in the 20th century, the other one would be a state, a fully fledged federal state, where of course the whole power is in the center. And the states, the so-called states, the member states, are then only provinces of this federal state. So this does not help us further, because the treaties contain elements of both. And so I tried to find examples in the past, which did in fact exist, of confederations, I called it. The terminology differs here. Confederations, this means this is something in between. The power structure is undecided. The states come together to protect themselves against external enemies, but also from each other, and to moderate their association peacefully by rule of law, by the law. And this means, of course, that they have somehow to subject themselves to the law as administered by this confederation. And this is already, I think this shows quite well the problem we have, but it also shows us solutions. And the solution is in the making aware of the common fundaments. And this has gone lost in the past because there is a redefinition and a new understanding, an aggressive reinterpretation of the concepts of freedom, democracy, which I could not point out here. This would be the topic of another conference in the past decades. And this is a dramatical change. It is a qualitative change. We are leaving with these reinterpretations the modern terms which we have developed in the last 500 years and which culminated in the early 20th century or so. And since then, there has been this reinterpretation which dissolves the fundaments. The terms of freedom have been reversed. The terms of family, the institutions themselves, like the universities or the churches, etc., have been reformed, reinterpreted, and undermined in a certain way. That is dangerous because we are losing the common ground that made the European civilization strong, not only politically, in power political forms, but also in the sense of high culture and high achievements in all fields of culture and science, etc. This is breaking away, and we must have a discussion on that. And it must be an all-European discussion, because I'm sure that what was constructed in the last 500 years in modernity, since Renaissance and Enlightenment, goes back to the common roots in Christianity and antiquity, and it was all European in the sense of this Western European concept, the Roman Catholic world in the Middle Ages, and what has developed from that. So if we are not aware of this treasure, I could lecture for hours what this means. If we are not aware of this treasure, and we are no longer aware of it, we are losing the ground, the common ground in Europe, and we must strengthen that and must become aware that it is only the European nations who stand for that and who can defend this commonly. And of course, they must also defend it internally against attacks from a certain side. The common culture, yeah, this was already your second question. The common culture is something very precious, very sophisticated, but as it is developed in all fields of politics and law, to describe what it means would in fact consider I need another conference or lectures, long lectures on what it means, in order to revive the idea, which goes far beyond what is usually discussed, even among lawyers, when we discuss principles like freedom, democracy, etc. It's also superficial. It has become superficial, and when it becomes superficial, reinterpretation becomes easy. And this is exactly what happens. So I'm not sure, this was a very abstract answer, but I hope I answered your two questions. The power structure cannot be solved. There must be a continuous discussion if we don't want a central imperial federal state on one side, or if we don't want the total breaking up of the European project, which we need if we consider the world and fall back into nationalisms, which we had in the 20th century. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gert, for that answer. There was a further question by Altai for you, so we'll pass the mic to him.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Gert, for your analysis and also for the conclusions you have suggested. I am a little torn. I think in your analytical parts, especially when it comes to the analysis of the European Union, there is much that I can easily agree with. When it comes to the conclusions, I have very serious difficulties. Let's forget about the European Union. Let's just concentrate on Germany, and let's try to imagine how a process might look like to find out what the cultural what the basis for a cultural identity in Germany might be. How is that even possible to imagine? Either we would have votes after votes after votes, and one minority view would ultimately win this process of elections, and then a certain kind of cultural religious identity would have to be imposed over the majority, which would result in outcry. So you have evoked explicitly the Christian heritage. David spoke of imperialism. But what is that? What does it mean to different people in the European Union and worldwide? You have only identified some aspects that you construct, remember, as very positive, high standing, high culture, high civilizations. But if we had a different consistency here in the audience, it would be extremely dim how the same times or aspects would be reconstructed. So what is the culture that now in the 21st century actually unites most people living in the European Union? Is it Christianity? Well, just one side remark. I grew up as a Catholic in the Rhineland. I visited Poland for the first time when I was 19 years old at the International Thésée meeting, was in a Catholic village, enjoyed very much the hospitality, made friendships, but was appalled by the difference of religious approach, a world apart. And what I've seen now, decades later, is that many young people in Poland, in Spain, that had been very conservatively religious a generation earlier, are now completely breaking away from this religious tradition that some of you are idealizing. So the question is, what process might we identify in order to embark on a constructive process to identify what might unite us in terms of value, religion, or what else? So I end this train of thought here, but because that results in aporia. But what I do see is that what unites is the new culture, the constitutional culture, the culture of human rights that developed after World War II for most Western European civilizations or nations, with problems, always with problems, nowhere perfect. And for most Eastern European nations after the fall of the Iron Curtain, with problems. But the freedom we have to express ourselves is so cherished by everyone as we are sitting here. That is something we cannot take for granted. I think that is something that unites us. And that's not in Christianity. I'm sorry if you know Christian history. So, and since you are German, you will remember the discourse on the so-called Leitkultur that Angela Merkel tried to start earlier in her chancellorship. And it failed, it was aborted. Now I regret that it was aborted, because what I have learned here is the urgent need to have this discussion. We need this discussion about identity, and we also need to bear with other views. So it is good that we learn that what matters to you and to many sitting here, but we need to find kind of a Leitkultur that really the vast majority of the people living in the European Union can effectively sign up for. So I would really want to send out the message to most speakers of today and yesterday that, of course, from my perspective, come from a very conservative perspective, to find ways to address the center of society, or even the center left, to embark on a constructive discussion so that we can rebuild constructively our European Union as much as our nation states, because both of them, or all of them, are in need and are in crisis. I end here, and thank you for your patience with me.
Thank you very much. I'll try. This question is very important because it gives me the opportunity of clearing away a misunderstanding. I did not say that Europe should be a Christian organization, or that the European states should be Christian theological states. What I say is we have the basis in Enlightenment. For me, Enlightenment is the center, and this is the common basis for Europe, and the understanding based on freedom, and freedom corresponding with responsibility, which is often overlooked and even practically overlooked in court decisions. Freedom has to correspond with responsibility, and freedom has to be exercised within certain institutions that care for our education in the broadest sense, not like children are educated, but we educate each other by communicating. And these institutions are the family, are universities, for example, or even firms in which we work. And this all it has to be organized in a way that fosters freedom. And this is the basis. And this basis comes, if you look back from very old sources, yeah, it has not been invented from scratch in the phase of Enlightenment, but the Enlightenment tried to clear it from the elements that were somehow superstitious or something that we didn't need. They tried to fundamentalize it on a critical basis, and but what they then found out as the basis of our European civilization was in fact the consequence of old ideas dating back to Christian belief and dating back to antiquity. And I don't say we should all be Christians or have a public role of Christianity, but we should be aware of where it comes from and why this was developed. And the same is the case. I don't say we should become Greeks, old Greeks, reigning our cities like in a polis, but we can learn from the Greeks what democracy means or what philosophy means. First, real philosophy beyond some mystic thinking or something like that. So all these things we owe to the old Greeks. We owe our legal system, the whole legal thinking, to the Romans and many other things. And we owe a lot of things to Christian ideas of you have to live for the community, you have to sacrifice yourself. Christ sacrificed himself for all of us. This was the ideal. And like this, the theologians very early in the Middle Ages, when Europe came into existence, they turned barbarian warriors into knights who had a certain ideal, who fought for the poor. Whether they always did it is another question, but this was an ideal that was new. And new ideals, they work. They don't totally function, but you have to have ideals. Like, if you shoot with a bow and arrow, you have to aim high up to hit the aims somewhere standing on the bottom. And it's the same here. We need ideals, and we need ideals that need not to be Christian ideals. I think any Muslim or Jew or any other religious person can understand this and can find it back in our legal system, that we follow somehow these old ideas that come from Christianity, that come from antiquity, and that were transformed, of course, not only through the Middle Ages, but then decisively in Renaissance and the Enlightenment into a secular, with all the problems, but into a secular philosophy that was worked out by all European philosophers, we can name them all, and we will have names from all countries in Europe who contributed to that and who referred to each other. When you read Kant, who was mentioned, he quotes without quoting the name because everybody knew who had said this, Hobbes, Baudin, and others, and so on. If you go all through these classics, you see that they quote the other Europeans, and of course the antiquity and the Bible, without telling us that they are quoting this. But their whole thinking was in this way, and in this way we have developed a civilization that has come to a very, very high standard, not only materially, but idealistically, and what concerns high culture, learning, self-education, and all these things. And this is, by the way, what I connect with Kant and Hegel and the others. They may have said other things, I don't know their whole works. I was mainly concentrated always on their writings that are important for law and understanding politics. But what they said there is of a very, very high standard and with a high idealism. And it is not German idealism, it is universal idealism that you can read from that. And it is totally based and was developed in a vivid communication with French, British, Dutch, and probably also Polish thinkers. So they all contributed and they found out with high standard thinking the basis of a civilization that can really work on the basis of liberty, freedom, democracy, and bring good results if we follow it. And it was partly followed and contributed to the rise of the West, but it is now no longer understood. And this is my plea to start again a discussion on these things. We might do it on the academic level, and we should also institutionalize it. We should institutionalize it in the universities or even in schools, that our pupils even learn this common European basis that is there. And again, this is not Christian in the proper sense, as little as it is Greek or Roman in the ancient sense. But it can be traced back to the thinkers of these times who started the thinking from which we still live, if we try to understand our own identity as Europeans.